and ministered to inmates both Protestant and Catholic. The federal government granted that permission, and Mullen felt very, very pleased because he felt that if the federal government was providing for the inmates' physical wants, that there should also be some provision there for their spiritual needs. And so he got that. The last way that I said that prisoners were supposed to reform was behaviorally. And in the penitentiaries, again, you're supposed to be industrious. They're basically engaging in manufacturing. So it's arguably a masculine task. But the irony with military prisons is that the duties that the men were required to assume were oftentimes considered feminine. So for example, at Camp Chase in 1862, there was a prisoner named I.C. Carnier who wrote to his wife that while at Camp Chase, he did a great deal of cooking, washing, and various other things about housekeeping. He noted that this was, in some cases, a struggle because he admitted that men were bad homekeepers, but he hoped that the experience at Camp Chase doing these kind of female duties would make him, in his words, useful to his wife once he got out. So prisoners resisted by behavior, they resisted by maintaining hope in God, and they also resisted by physically trying to escape. So prisoners at both military prisons and penitentiaries knew that entryways were porous, and they engaged in some very similar acts of resistance. So for example, in June 1843, 70 convicts conspired to escape from the Georgia Penitentiary. They agreed to a signal. At that point, they rushed the guard, broke open the gate. 11 of the fugitives dispersed amid fire from the guards. One was terribly wounded, 6 were recaptured, and another died from wounds incurred in a fight with 2 men who were sent to detain him. An eerily similar scenario occurred 21 years later in July 1864 at Camp Chase. Confederate prisoners there plotted a stampede when they saw a sanitary cart exit the gate symbolically on July 4th. So once that sanitary cart reached the gate, a gang of prisoners rushed and overpowered the sentinel. 30 of them fled as the Ohio guards, like those in Georgia, quickly fired. 2 were wounded, others hid in the nearby woods. They were not ultimately successful. So members of the 88th Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment that was tasked to guard Camp Chase eventually recaptured all of the runaways. 2 of them withstood bullet wounds, and 1 consequently had his arm amputated because of the wound that he incurred. Now, according to the laws of war, in case you're curious, this is kind of an interesting way to phrase this, Lieber wrote that it was the duty of prisoners of war to escape. But if guards caught them in the act, they could shoot them. So there's a balance of power there. In some cases, though, there were sympathetic guards. So by the end of the war, especially in North Carolina, there was a lot of unionists. And the Confederacy was short on manpower. And in one instance, they stationed Lieutenant Wellborn, who was actually a unionist, who defected from the rebel army, and he was guarding Salisbury. There were 2 very prominent Northern journalists held in Salisbury prison. They were Junius Brown and Albert Richardson. So they detected that Wellborn was, in fact, sympathetic to the Union cause. They started talking to him, which violates all sorts of prison rules, but they did. And so Wellborn eventually told Brown and Richardson how to get out, how to get through the Confederate territory and into Union lines. And so they effectively escaped. The most famous escape was done by tunnel. It was by this guy. This is Confederate Cavalry General John Hunt Morgan. And this is another really good example of that kind of blurring of the lines between state authority and military authority in the penitentiaries. So John Hunt Morgan, between June and July 1863, raided the state of Ohio virtually unopposed. Eventually, Union soldiers detained them, and in order to totally insult Morgan, what Union officials decided to do was to not house him as a prisoner of war, but jail him as a common horse thief in the Ohio penitentiary. But they figured he could never escape. But what they did when they put Morgan in the penitentiary, even though they classified him as a criminal, was they took him out of the oversight of the state guards, and they put a federal detachment of troops supervising Morgan and his men. There's about 30 of his men in the Ohio penitentiary with him. Well, the federal guards were not familiar with penitentiary discipline, and they did not inspect the cells of Morgan and his men. And so every time they went to dinner, they would start confiscating spoons and plates and knives and forks. They realized that they're inhabiting this lower range of cells that's near an air shaft, and for a couple of months, they start digging a tunnel. Until eventually, on the 20th of November, 1863, they got out, and Morgan reached the Confederacy. And kind of as a side note, he goes into Richmond. He's got, comrades who he knows from his home state of Kentucky held in Libby prison. And Confederate authorities let him in, and he starts talking to the Union prisoners, and he says, I tunneled out of the Ohio Penitentiary. And so lo and behold, prisoners at Libby prison decide they're going to do the same thing, except they don't get away with it. So Morgan inspires that. But anyway, back to the story of Ohio. Once Morgan got out, the warden of the Ohio Penitentiary, his name was Nathaniel Marion, he was irate, and he basically wrote a scathing letter to the United States government saying that if Morgan and his men had been left in civil authority, they would have never pulled this off, because his guards knew how to oversee a prison. So authority at the penitentiary was blurred. Identity was blurred between penitentiaries and military prisons, and there was always a comparison, really, between those two institutions. So I have up here, I don't know how well you can see this, a few examples of that. The first example that I have here is from Daniel Meeker. He was a U.S. Army surgeon, and he was let into Richmond to inspect Richmond's military prisons in 1863. And there he makes a direct comparison between penitentiaries and military prisons. He says, no prisoner penitentiary ever seen in a northern state equaled in cheerlessness, unhealthiness, and paucity of rations issued either of the military prisons of Richmond, Virginia. Another comparison from Private William Duff, who was held at Camp Chase. He basically says there's no distinction between people who are incarcerated. It doesn't matter the kind of institution. He says, let prison life be what it is. It may be of war or criminal or by quarantine or detention in some way. Being deprived of liberty and freedom is a terror and a horror to anyone. A few more examples about really the importance of labor. 19th century contemporaries really believed that prisoners should work. And so there was a letter written to the New York Times on November 26, 1861 regarding Camp Chase. And the author said, I'm opposed to releasing prisoners, but I would put them all to work where they can earn their own living, a service to their country which I fear most of them have never performed. Similar story at Johnson's Island, another letter to the editor of the New York Times, which was one of the biggest mass circulation newspapers in the Civil War era. Not the biggest, but one of the biggest. It was actually relatively new compared to others. But this author says, I do not wish unchristian retaliation, but could not these fellows work for their board upon the public works, as well as be pampered in idleness? And so some Johnson's Island inmates were forced to work. It was mostly to police their own quarters, though, to save the United States government money. They were officers. They didn't know how to work. A lot of them were slave owners. They hadn't done a lot of work in their life, so they're not familiar with that. The last comparison here comes from a prisoner from Andersonville, and he's comparing himself to arguably one of the worst kind of convicts, a murderer. He says, we are shut off from the rest of the world and cannot hear half as much news as a murderer, nor are we treated half as well. So they understood how prisons were supposed to operate based on their knowledge from the antebellum period, but that wasn't happening, certainly not at Andersonville. These ideas really transcended the institutions that I looked at. And this is an article in The Liberator, which was an abolitionist newspaper, that has an account of some soldiers from Ohio who were detained at an unnamed prison in Georgia. And this article notes that when they were detained, they were treated as felons were before prisons were reformed. They were put in irons, starved, and denied light and air for nearly a year. 7 of them were dragged in irons to the scaffold and executed. Lieutenant Burritt of Ohio, who received 100 lashes on his back, rather than disclose the name of the leader of the expedition, was one of the witnesses. They were sent after the Battle of Corinth to destroy a railroad, and that's when they got captured. So same punishments, same treatment that was apparent in the penitentiaries prior to the Civil War breaking out. Oops. No, go back. There we go. Last points that I wanted to make for today is the closing of some of these military prisons. Specifically, Johnson's Island Salisbury and Camp Chase really illustrated the idea that prisons should in some way affect positive change in society. And the way that that happened was, in the case of Camp Chase, federal officials from that property made provision to care for the veterans who served the country during the Civil War after the prison was closed. So in 1867, the House of Representatives directed that the materials from Camp Chase be used for the benefit of the National Asylum for Disabled Soldiers. And President Andrew Johnson approved that measure on March 21st, 1867. At Castle Thunder, they took the original key to that building and sent it to New York. And in 1865, that key was auctioned off, and the proceeds went to benefit the Orphans of Union Volunteers, which offered them temporary assistance in the war's aftermath. In North Carolina, at Salisbury, the Freedmen's Bureau actually got possession of this property. And they were going to auction off that site. And they sold it to the highest bidder. That netted them $1,600. And those proceeds were used by the Freedmen's Bureau to help newly freed slaves acquire food, clothing, and other provisions. Finally, the purpose of Johnson's Island, we see the picture of the cemetery there, was largely reflective. When that prison was closed in 1865, the federal government noted that it would slowly remove the fortifications in the Ordnance Department, but it would keep the Union and Confederate cemeteries intact. A fact that one newspaper was sure would form an attractive feature for years to come. So these prisoners' graves, which included both POWs and civilian citizens here, as you can see, they would be a site, ideally, of pilgrimage, where people could visit their relatives who lost their lives during the war, and in so doing, they could spend a few minutes meditating, not just on the Civil War, but also on the crisis of imprisonment that it inspired. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has, please.
Well, in looking at the amount of prisoners that died on both sides, what struck me is that there were more prisoners that died under Union. The Union was holding. Now I understand in Andersonville, and I can see how prisons like Andersonville, where the South simply didn't have the food, the resources to feed these people, and they just enclosed them in where they just dug holes in the ground and lived underground. I could see how there would be a lot of deaths there. But I'm wondering if the larger number that had died under the hands of the Union authorities, did that have anything to do with the Union having more prisoners than the South had?
It did. I mean, and especially after the exchange cartel broke down in 1863. But that said, there's also the issue of ability to supply and where supplies are being sent. And so while the North was certainly better prepared on that standpoint, they still did not necessarily funnel enough resources to the individual prisons. Okay. The other part of the equation is, and I mean, the death rate, like in a place like Johnson's Island, is relatively low. The officers, unquestionably, were treated better. But in the North, especially this time of year, I mean, these guys are out in the cold, and that contributed to a lot of disease and things that they weren't necessarily used to being down south. So Southerners had it worse as far as supply goes. But even though the North was more knit together by internal improvements, railroads, canals, which were still in use during the Civil War, they're still not diverting those resources necessarily to those prisons.
And the weather played it.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because epidemics broke out. And at this point in the Civil War, it's unfortunate that they don't understand germ theory. I mean, they're 2 years away from that by the time the war is over. It's first really popularized in 1867 in Europe. They understood epidemics. So throughout the war, they would understand, like, there's a typhoid epidemic, there's a cholera epidemic, there's a yellow fever epidemic. And they knew to kind of clean up from those things, but they didn't understand much about disease and how it actually spread. And so they don't have precautions in place to deal with that, for sure.
Just curious, was Francis Lieber influenced by Bentham? Bentham?
A little bit, yes, but more so Elam Lynn's would have been influenced by Bentham. The idea of the panopticon.
Yes, I was thinking about that. Because I was thinking about, you didn't talk about that, the whole idea of penitence.
Yes.
But the idea of how the construction of the penitentiary itself.
Yes, that was much more prevalent with Linz, although the difference between Linz and Lieber is that Linz promoted what was called the Congregate system of labor. So the prisoners were supposed to be in solitary confinement at night, and then they'd work in congregate shops during the day. What Lieber supported was a solitary system of confinement, where I had the picture of, from Eastern State Penitentiary. I used that, I didn't study that in the book, but I mean, it's one of the few penitentiaries you can actually still visit. So Lieber supported the solitary system where the inmates were supposed to be held in a single cell, and they worked in this all the time. So they didn't leave here. They were basically fed their food through these doors. So that was one of the differences as far as the penitentiary programs go. But yeah, Lieber was certainly in favor of that constant supervision. That would be kind of where he's coming from in terms of certainty of punishment.
And were there black concentrated prisoner war camps, or were they all just put together?
There were very few black prisoners through the Civil War generally. So there were some black prisoners that were held at Andersonville, and usually when they were detained, they were put on work detail. And that was a really divisive thing to have happen, because the guys who are in the stockade, the white prisoners, they want out. And going to gather wood or whatever they're tasked to do is a way to do that. But from the standpoint of the Confederacy, they're taking those black POWs and forcing them to work because it's basically re-implementing slavery. So there's kind of a disconnect in the interpretation of that. In the North, there was, remember when I was talking about David Todd, one of the things that Columbus civilians went nuts about when he was kind of appointing commandants was he had one commandant who was actually one of the chaplains at the Ohio Penitentiary prior to the Civil War. His name was Granville Moody, and he was appointed commandant at Camp Chase. And Granville Moody allowed Confederate soldiers who were captured with their slaves to keep their slaves in the camp with them. And the Columbus civilians went crazy about it. And they ended up petitioning the Lincoln administration and saying, this has got to stop. And eventually it did, but for a time that was going on in Columbus. Yeah.
One final thing. I was watching The Hateful Eight, which is the Samuel L. Jackson character talks about the prison, you know, and as a matter of fact, it's kind of fortuitous that I was watching that movie this week, and I saw you.
Right.
And one of the reasons why I came was that film, the Samuel L. Jackson is talking about the treatment of black prisoners of war in The Hateful Eight.
Yeah. Absolutely. They were very, very few, like I said, African Americans incarcerated prior to the Civil War generally. And really the reason for that is there's few women too. I mean, when I went through prison registers for penitentiaries for this study, I mean, I could count on one hand the number of African Americans and the number of women. And the reason is because this program was designed to create productive citizens. And both of those groups were written outside of that definition of citizen at the time. So they were judged by the law, but they weren't necessarily able to reform, and that was the point. So once the Civil War is over, then the demographics absolutely flip. They absolutely flip, yeah.
Also, weren't many of the prisoners from Andersonville brought here to Wilmington?
They were, when they were being evacuated, they did pass through Wilmington, for sure. Yeah.
First one.
Two kind of related questions. You mentioned some of the prisons had political prisoners. You describe briefly what a political prisoner was as opposed to
a POW?
And then sort of related to that, did the prisons mix Northerners and Southerners?
They do. I mean, the way that the classification schemes were supposed to work is the commandants of the military prisons were supposed to keep accurate records of the name of the person incarcerated, the unit if they were a soldier, the hometown if they were a political prisoner. And then in some places, most commonly in the structures like Castle Thunder, Old Capitol Prison, there were actual buildings. They did try to keep them separate. But I mean, this is trial by fire, really. And so while they're categorizing the prisoners, they're not, by the end of the war, actually keeping them separate. They just don't have the ability to do it. And some of the wardens outright refuse. They're like, that's not my job. I'm not going to categorize these people. I'm just going to hold them. So the political prisoners on both sides were targeted after both presidents suspended habeas corpus. And they were mostly suspected, I mean, they could be arrested on suspicion since habeas corpus is suspended, of supporting one side or the other. So that's where we had like a lot of like journalists. There's kind of it's a weird definition though in the Lieber Code, because the way Lieber defines a prisoner of war is basically, obviously soldiers, but also civilians who have acted in arms. And that's kind of difficult to prove. But he also includes journalists, he includes sutlers, so the lines of definition are really murky. And that's really a function of, it's a product of the time, I mean, not to use a bad cliche, but this is the first time that the US government is really centralizing. This is the first time they have to figure out how to deal with these things. And so as much as they did want to have these classifications, like you could point to that in certain cases, but the lines are still blurred. Any other questions?
Good.
How quickly after the Civil War did the convict lease system start? I mean, were these prisons immediately turned into these institutions that were going to hold black people and workers after the Civil War?
Yes, very quickly. 1860s, 1870s. So there was a push against that in the North. And really the reason why is because free labor. So even though unions had very little power at this point in history, there was still enough push from workers in the North and northern industries to stop prison labor. Whereas in the South, I mean, in the latter part of the 19th century is where we get places like Parchman Farm, where, I mean, it's a farce. I mean, those prisoners are leased out to various companies, so that does happen all across the South. And a lot of the rail lines were constructed in that way, and it became a very brutal system because, I mean, literally the governor of Mississippi says if one convict dies, you just get another. So, yeah, that happened very, very quickly.
And there have been two interesting books that have come out, I guess, over the past 2 years on black women in the convict lease system. Yes,
there's no distinction there. It's primarily men, but there were absolutely females there as well, for sure.
All right. Thank you again.
Wow. Thank you all.
If you want to get a copy of the book, of course, the gift shop is open. Over there, follow, yes, Leslie across. If you want to take a look around, please do stick around, ask some questions, explore the house. You can see the hurricane damage if you go to the top, which is still kind of evident. But do come back and visit us. And again, thank you all for coming, and stay warm. Thank you.
Thank you. I know.